It is not often that I get my sessions advertised for free as part of the keynote, but I thought it was really great yesterday when we talked about what I think is a really important statistic, that 75% of all compromises involved in some way or another credential theft. I looked at that and I thought, number one, kind of cool, free advertising for my session. Number two, yeah, it's still pretty rough out there. And that's what we're here to talk about today, this concept of credential theft, and to make sure that we all understand what is this thing, what can I do about it, what should the products be doing about it, what are the benefits I have of using the latest and greatest, because obviously it's something that we are very attuned to, and to really understand what all of these concepts are. So that's what we're going to cover today. And the reason why this ends up being so important is just, watch the news. It's a rough place out there. We have transitioned from a world in which adversaries were really trying to make a name for themselves, to show that they could do it. It was really just to be mischievous, just to have a challenge or to make someone look bad, put some egg in their face. And that transition to the point where suddenly we involved organized crime and big money became at stake. And they were going after resources that they could monetize in major ways. And now we're starting to see it evolve to also include a lot of cyber espionage. It's a dangerous place out there. In fact, many have said, we're at war. We're at war against a human adversary who is evolving at the same rate that we are. And the way that we think about security needs to evolve as well. We need to think in terms of the adversaries. And when I think about how do I prioritize security, how do I do security right, we've now completely left the era in which we just need to get the right advice on what security things I should do and go do it. If you are involved in security, and if you are doing technology, you are involved in security, whether you like it or not, you now have no shortage of really great advice. Your job is no longer find the good advice and do that. It has become find the good advice that I can afford to ignore right now while I go and do this other even better advice that's going to give even more rewards. That's quite a change. I no longer have to find good things. I have to find ignorable things from the plethora of great advice that I have. And that's what we hope to convey today, is to really talk about what's out there and most important, and two perspectives that I like to look at this from. Number one, the perspective of the adversary. What are they trying to do to me? And how can I protect against that? I see a lot of security conversations devolve into, let me imagine all of the potential hypothetical threats that could potentially happen. And oh, I can imagine a world in which this threat actually exists. And while certainly a fun mental exercise, it's a lot more valuable to spend your time protecting against the actual adversaries that exist in the real world rather than the imagined ones. Not that you shouldn't do that at all, but if you haven't done a protection against what people are really doing in the wild today, it might be a bit too soon to be thinking of advanced threats. And in fact, when we look at the statistics of what adversaries are using today, every single time something bad happens, the organization to which that happened comes out and says, yeah, we were dealing against a new, brand new, never before seen, very, very advanced threat that no one could have possibly seen coming. We are not culpable, right? This was someone who was just incredibly smart, hyper smart, may in fact be from the planet Krypton, doing this incredibly complicated assault against us. The reality is, most infections, most attacks begin with user interaction required. I've sent you an email, you clicked on something, I gained a toehold on your box. Conveniently, you left all of your users as local administrators. You, of course, turned UAC off because, hey, why wouldn't you? And boom, all of a sudden we're done. This is not an advanced persistent threat. This is the same old that we know very well, that we've never cleaned up. And when we look at, well, which percentage of actual attacks involve leveraging some zero-day exploit, it's not exactly the majority. There's that tiny, tiny little sliver right there of actual exploits that were 0 days and weren't just leveraging the same old, going after user interaction required. So when you think about how attackers are working, I've tended to, at least today, and of course this is always evolving, we have human adversaries who are evolving right now, but I tend to lump them into two groups. I lump them into the adversary who's trying to capture your entire identity infrastructure, because once he has your identity infrastructure, he's got incredibly valuable assets. Number one, he can be anybody in your organization, whoever they want to be. Number two, that also typically comes with a roadmap for how to attack you. Here are all of the OUs I have. Once I'm on the domain controller, I can see, well, what kind of businesses are you in? Oh, here's an interestingly named OU. I'm sitting here inside of Apple Corporation. This is totally hypothetical. And oh, here's the OU watch design. Interesting. And now I have a roadmap. Now I can see who's in there. What are the users? And I can start to target them. I have a ton of incredibly useful information. So useful, in fact, that it can potentially combat the fact that this is probably the part of your network that you're monitoring the most closely. It's a very noisy intrusion, but if you succeed, it's an incredibly valuable intrusion, and that's why people do it. The other type of adversary, again, as I categorize them today, is the person who already knows who or what they're going after and is specifically finding a way to target that. An example of this is an organization that had a small team that was focused on a really highly specific project. It was scientific in nature, highly, highly specific, unique, and what the adversary had done was build a Facebook group, of all things, and put on the group page an image that contained a compromise, hoping or betting or maybe even knowing that that organization hadn't kept their patches up to date, and sent out an invite. Attendees of this conference, a highly specific conference that would appeal to people who did this one thing at this one company, from this state in the US. And 3 of those people joined that group. They target them. They've done their homework. So there's 2, and we need to think about how do we protect ourselves from at least these 2 categories of adversaries. Because the way that we used to think about how we protect ourselves was to build a castle, firewall everything, segregate firewalls will solve it all, and what firewalls don't solve, maybe we'll get some really, really juicy antivirus, that'll clean up the rest of it, and then we'll build some more firewalls. And the way that we used to build a castle doesn't work anymore. We are way too mobile. There are people in this room with devices that are not sitting behind your corporate firewall right now. We're not protecting you. If you've ever gone to a coffee shop, if you own a laptop, you're not behind the corporate firewall. We don't live in a castle that we can protect from the outside world anymore. We live in a city. And in a city, the way I protect myself is quite different. Most other people in that city with me sharing all of these resources, my bandwidth, connectivity, they're good people. Maybe not in this room. But in general, right, most people out there are decent people that aren't trying to hurt you. And there are people who are actively trying to hurt you, just like in a real city. And there are ways that you can protect yourself when you're doing that. You protect yourself by being pretty smart, being aware of your surroundings. You're never going to get rid of all the bad people, right? If you figure that out, there's a really good job for you in government, right? But we haven't figured that out yet, so we're like, you know what, we have to assume that there's going to be bad people and try to put things in place to try and keep those bad people from doing bad things. Same thing in the security world. And we need to do smart things when we assume the fact there's probably some bad people here. If I'm going to a city that's not very safe, I'm probably not going to wear my solid gold suit. which normally I wear places, but not here. I don't trust you guys here, right? But you just don't bring it with you. That's a high-value asset that I don't bring along with me for the ride, and that's the way I need to start thinking about it. So what I want to do is give you some tools and share with you the way that I and a lot of other folks at Microsoft think about how do we protect ourselves and understand the threats that are out there. The framework that I use to kind of say, have we actually got a complete solution, is to look at what are we doing to protect ourselves. That's what we're used to in the security world, right? Build our defenses, build the castle walls as high as we can. We still need to do smart things to protect ourselves, but we also need to not only try to prevent compromise, but assume that we'll never get perfect. There are too many endpoints, something's going to fall, and if we assume compromise, assume breach, while still trying to prevent it, then we realize we have a third bit that we need to bring in as well. We need to be able to react. The typical reaction we get from a customer who has experienced a breach is not a whole lot of sleep, panic, not much sleep and more panic, and wow, I don't know what to do now, and kind of freezing up. It's a really tough spot to be in, and most people don't have that plan. My colleague Jessica is actually giving a talk because that's what she does for a living. She gets brought in when someone has a breach, and she's giving a talk on that tomorrow morning at 11:30 as well to go through the details of what you can do to prepare for that. But preparing for that is really important if you want to respond quickly and shut it down. So today, we're not going to go a whole lot into the response bit, although it's important that you're aware it's part of the strategy. We really want to talk about the things you can do to protect yourselves and a little bit on the detection bit. So when we look at what a typical threat looks like, we'll do it visually, and then I'm actually going to go and hack some stuff because that's kind of how I roll. When we look at what happens, I've got an organization, and someone starts sending out emails to a whole bunch of people. They get a whole bunch of addresses, and they're like, hey, here's some information. Go ahead and click this link. And the adversaries that we're up against are getting smarter and smarter and smarter. And the emails are getting better. They're not great yet. And we actually start circulating some of the things that we see internally and a lot of our internal discussion aliases within Microsoft. We look at some of the things that they're doing, and the number of grammatical errors is declining. It's not zero yet, right? So we can still usually tell if we're taking our time, but it's declining. And they're also getting more and more targeted. For example, I worked with one customer where what the adversary has done is they had gotten a hold of someone's credentials just to listen in on email. So it was one person's endpoint, weak password. They weren't using multi-factor authentication. So once they got the password, then they could read their email. Once they had the ability to read their email, they could see all of those corporate emails that we send around. Here's the email from our corporate chief financial officer giving details of our findings. Now I know the name of the person and their email address who is the CFO at this organization. Here's the emails from IT and all the projects we have going and when it's impacting. Aha, they have a project. You'll be expecting an email at this time. They're able to listen in on standard corporate dialogue, harmless things that gave them the ability to craft that initial phishing mail that was even more impactful, more likely to elicit a response. And eventually, someone's going to open one. We can't stop this. We can try and reduce it. We can do things with user education, try and make it grow smaller, but getting it to zero is really, really hard, and you get to the point of diminishing returns. What you want to prevent is this. Hey, I've grabbed one endpoint. I can now go to any other endpoint. I can start moving around until eventually I come upon a device that, lo and behold, Mr. Domain Admin, you've gone ahead and logged in. Now I have your credentials, and with those credentials, I can own the identity infrastructure and get access to absolutely everything along with this roadmap, and your environment is toast. And the tough thing about that is that once someone has owned the identity infrastructure, it's really, really hard to be sure that they're gone. You can think they're gone. You can remove what you know, but there's lots of ways that they can open up a little back door for them to come along later. I had one customer I worked with where what they had done was they'd added an ACL entry onto their Active Directory database that granted everyone and anonymous users read access to it. That wasn't the admin who did that, we don't think. I mean, we don't know for sure because it wasn't an audited change. But an adversary could do that. It's kind of a smart thing for them to do. Now I just come along later, now when you're not looking for me anymore, and I can get a whole new dump of that database and have read access and maybe not trigger an alarm because I don't have to go and grab your credentials. I can go and grab the whole database and then grab what I want. Really tough to know. So you want to avoid that to the maximum extent possible. So I want to show what that looks like for anyone who hasn't seen it. I know it's been demoed kind of a lot, but I want to kind of give an example and kind of talk about it. And so I'm using a device right now, and this device potentially belongs to John Key, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. So he's working on his to-do list, right, what he's going to do today. So he's going to make it illegal to make strawberry pavs. You're going to have to make them with kiwi from now on. That's going to be a new initiative they're spinning up in New Zealand. But what he doesn't know is that someone else has gotten onto his device. And that someone else, Mr. Badgie, B-A-D-G-U-Y, it's pronounced Badgie, as we all learned from the Muppet movie, already has a presence on that system. And so with his presence on that system, he can go in and find out all of the hashes that are on that system that could potentially use to replay. Now, as we kind of in the pre-show candy giveaway, I think only resulted in 2 bits of candy being given away, we talked about there are multiple different ways to do it. This is a landman hash or LM hash or NTLM or however you want to call it, and I may be oversimplifying things and probably am. The reality is here's a bit of information I can use to authenticate over the network. And now I can go and steal it. And as soon as people see this, they start freaking out because that's the natural, normal human response to seeing your vulnerabilities is freak out and go fix it. And I can remove certain bits of LM hash. And I bring up when we talk about LM hash in that specifically I have, over the course of the past couple of months, had literally dozens of conversations where we get board-level initiatives to remove LM hash and make it impossible to use LM hash. And they have all of these plans, and here's the roadmap or how we're going to get there to remove this. Because the problem with LM hash is that it's not exactly the world's strongest hashing algorithm. It doesn't include a salt, so it makes it fairly straightforward to transcribe this into something that's reusable. So when you think about credentials and how they can be reused, what you want to think about is where can I reuse them and how long are they good for? Your hash is going to be good for some duration in time. So when you think of it that way, well, what's the most valuable credentials that you've got? It's your password. Because your password is good until your next password reset. So it's probably the longest window of time you've got when grabbing the credentials until the time you can't use them anymore is of use to you. So you'd love to get the password. If I can take a bit of information that can be reverse engineered into the password fairly easily, I could just throw a rainbow table attack at it and determine what would have generated that, then suddenly now I have a really valuable credential. So I'd like to avoid that, and we see initiatives spinning up. And I saw a customer get almost to the point of having done that, and then he realized something rather troubling, is that in eliminating LM hash, they did not simultaneously eliminate wdigest. Wdigest is another clear text authentication protocol, and they could not remove it because they had apt-compat dependencies on it that they were going to break if it turned it off. So their plan was to invest a whole bunch of resources in taking this set of credentials. Let's go ahead and zoom, right? This set of kind of scrambled credentials that I could potentially fairly easily decode, while they were leaving this set of credentials that doesn't even need to be decoded and couldn't get rid of it. That's what we call not a good use of your investments. Because if you have your wallet, someone takes your wallet and it's got your ATM card in it, and you're like, I have a scrambled up version of my PIN code for my ATM. It's at home in the safe and no one can get it. But your PIN is written down on your card, you're actually not any safer. You haven't even inconvenienced the adversary. They already have what they want. It's one less step for them. So we need to be mindful of what we're trying to protect. You want to protect the password, so eliminating wdigest, really good idea. Eliminating LM hash, also a good idea. It's not a bad idea just because it's incomplete. Still a good idea. But then I'm still going to be left with some credentials that may be usable, such as my Kerberos tickets, which I can also pull out of what's stored in LSASS. I have access to that as well. So I have all these different forms, and while I can eliminate some of them, I'm never going to eliminate all of them because this is how single sign-in works. If I don't have any cached copy, that means every time you access a resource, you'll need to re-authenticate. And that kind of sucks from a user experience standpoint. No one will tolerate that. So I just need to think about how can I react and respond to that to protect. So those are my credentials. And that's what the adversaries can do. How many of you have never seen that before, never seen like plucking out all that? So everyone here, a handful of folks. Yeah, something to think about. We need to think holistically about what our strategy is, right? Because what we're fighting against is we're fighting against adversaries who've gotten really good at figuring out how to use this stuff. When we look at the typical attack timeline today, and it's actually gotten better, from the time when we have an initial compromise, when we have a successful compromise of an environment, it has been, on average, between 24 and 48 hours from the initial endpoint until the entire environment's been compromised. 1 to 2 days. And while they're sitting there exfiltrating data, the amount of time it takes before we determine or detect what's happening is typically on the order of 8 months. So there's a lot of time that they get to have access to my information before I even know they're there. And a lot of times when they know they're there, it's not because they found it. It's because they got a note. Dear so-and-so company, we have observed IP traffic going from your corporate network over to this known bad IP address over in Russia. You might want to do something about that. Love the government. And then they go, oh, crap. What do I do about that? So what do you do about that? How do you protect that? And when we think about credentials and the things that I can do, a lot of it comes down to credential hygiene, just doing smart things that help protect those credentials. And when it comes right down to it, there is one and only one thing you can do to ensure that your credentials are not going to be stolen, and that is to not have them with you. Right? I'm fairly confident that my car is not going to be stolen on this trip from one of you, because I don't have it. It's back home. So it's probably not going to happen. And the same thing is true. That's the only way we can get there. And so when you think about that, it really comes down to credential hygiene as the first step. The solutions will always be people, process, and technology. Technology itself will never be enough. I need to make sure that my domain admins don't log into untrusted workstations, because then they don't have their credentials with them. Therefore, they can't be stolen. Untrusted workstation is anything that's not explicitly trusted, by the way. And I have seen people do this by accident. Right? We start talking about the architectures that we recommend to solve this. The challenge is it's kind of hard to control a domain admin because they're God in that environment. So it's really hard to put restrictions on someone who has the ultimate power over all of everything. But nonetheless, right, everyone's like, oh yeah, that sounds like kind of a good idea. I have seen an administrator who is a domain admin log in with his domain admin credentials on a device in a lab that I was in. I had access to it. I didn't work there. The door wasn't locked. who knows who else was in. He typed him in, hit enter, and then he was like, oh crap, that wrong, oh, hold on. And then suddenly he had to go through this big fire drill of, okay, let's see, when was the last time this machine was imaged? Who did the imaging? Do we have records of who was in the room? Do we have, I mean, they had to go through the security camera to see did anyone walk in here so that they might have planted malware on one of those devices. They had to go through that. And this is from a customer who was aware of credential hygiene. I watched a customer who was unaware of credential hygiene. The domain admin walked up to a device on a cash register in a store and typed them in because it made it really convenient for that person. Very, very easy. They could do whatever they wanted to on that device. Just typed them right in. And didn't know that there was anything wrong with that. If you've ever been to a retail store and you want to know how secure those devices are against people implanting stuff on it, it's very straightforward. Put on a tie, walk in, say you're from corporate, and walk up to any computer you want to. If you get stopped, I'd love to hear from you, because I've never heard of it happening. These are minimum wage employees in the US, at least, that are like, hey, whatever, you got a tie on, you must be good. Don't log on to untrusted workstation. It's as simple as that. It's hygiene. If you're the help desk, don't be domain admin. If you are a service, don't be domain admin. There are lots of services out there that it makes it easy for them to get whatever privilege they want by just having it. I had one bit of software I ran into where the job of the software was to take a script and run the script with local administrator rights. So they wrote a service with domain administrator rights that would create a local admin group and spin up a script with this thing on there, and it was on every single workstation in the environment. Well, think about what your threat profile is there. Any device gets compromised, the device grants whoever compromises it domain admin rights instantaneously. One hop on the device, and you own the rest. Services are really dangerous if they're on workstations, but in general, don't run them with domain admin rights. And then think about everything else that's running that has domain admin equivalent rights. If you are running backup software on your domain controllers, that backup software is domain admin equivalent. If you're running antivirus and it's managed antivirus on your domain controller, your antivirus administrator is domain admin equivalent. So we need to think about those basics and think about then, what could I be doing from an interaction model when I think about my human-based interaction as opposed to my automation-based interaction that could expose it? If I'm doing an interactive logon, I've got credentials left on the device. If I'm doing a remote desktop logon without restricted admin, I'm leaving credentials on the device, potentially to be stolen. So lots of things that can expose credentials and things I can do to limit the credentials that are exposed. So I want to be mindful of the behaviors that I have that might expose credentials to be stolen. And with those behaviors, to think about, well, how do I start to build a model to isolate that, right? So I'll rewind all the way back to the beginning, and I said you've got two perspectives I think are important. What are the adversaries doing, and what are my highest value assets? From an asset perspective, that's where this tier model works in. The tier model, it says the number one highest value asset you've got are the keys to all of your high value assets. We call that tier 0. That gives me access to everything else. Tier 1 is where all of my business data lives. So the sum total of all of my tier 1 is equal to one tier 0 key. It's everything I've got in one lump. But typically, I don't give everyone access to everything. And I say typically because there are lots and lots of people and organizations that will have the all server admins Active Directory group. You get membership in that, and you get the entirety of tier 1. It's a fairly common practice. Tier 2 is the same way. That's where people do work. That's where your laptops and your productivity devices live, is in tier 2. And the mechanism by which work gets done. Same thing. The sum total of all of my tier 2 devices is equal to the sum total of all of tier 1. Tier 1 servers, services, whether they're in my data center, whether they're in the cloud, wherever they are, right? Tier 1 is where I access them. All of these things are important, but if I start to phrase it that way, I can think of the right defenses, because I do different things. Different humans interact with my servers and my services than interact with Tier 2, my workstations. Tier 2, who's interacting with that? Well, the users and probably help desk. All right, that's something else worth thinking about. How do you do help desk administration? The most common construct that I see is, oh, just add everyone in the help desk to a group that gives them local admin rights on every single Tier 2 device in the entire organization. Well, that's not at all risky, because help desk is one of those positions that you only get promoted to after 20, 30 years at the company, right? You're like, finally, you know, Satya's next job, help desk at Microsoft. He can't wait. Right now we got Ballmer and Gates handling it right now, and they're getting kind of overwhelmed. But you think about that, right? Now we're taking people right out of trade school and giving them admin access to everything at once. That's where most people are. And this tier model helps you think through the different threat models and behaviors in peoples and organizations to start doing the right things, start doing things smart. And we do want to focus on getting the high-value assets first, prioritizing. Right? And this quote that I love, which I stole mercilessly, I'm actually not sure who originally stole it, but we all stole it from Dean Rusk, who was the Secretary of State in the US. If you protect your paper clips and your diamonds with equal vigor, turns out you'll end up with a whole lot more paper clips and a whole lot fewer diamonds. We need to focus our energies appropriately in the right stuff. So when we start thinking about the single most important thing, your domain admins, how do you protect against that? And the prescriptive architecture that we recommend for that is one that says we need to specifically go after the fact that a domain administrator, by definition, is really tough to control. Domain admins are going to be granted local admin rights on every single workstation in your entire environment without you having done anything. It just happens. And if they don't have them, they'll have enough privilege to go and add them to that. They cannot really be controlled with technology. So the way that we recommend thinking about how to protect that is to take that function and move it into an isolated forest. Now that isolated forest has come to take on the name the red forest. That terminology is kind of what gets circulated. We describe the architecture in our Pass the Hash white paper. It's typically called the red forest, and I'll kind of give you a little background on why that is. It's called the red forest not because the area around Chernobyl is now today known as the red forest because of the irradiation, but rather for a very important technical reason. When building the first slide to describe this architecture, the designer of that slide happened to choose the color red for that triangle. That's why we call it the red forest. But it kind of stuck, and that's what we think about it. But here's really how the architecture works. If I'm a domain admin, I'm not going to have a production domain account. I'm going to, well, I might for productivity work, but not for domain administration. I'm going to have an account in a separate administrative forest, and in that forest, I'm a standard user. There's nothing special about me. I can't turn off your auditing. I can't do anything. I'm just a guy or a girl. Nothing special about me. But through a one-way trust, I have domain admin rights on the one. So now I can say, well, you're not going to accidentally log into a device in the production environment because it's a lot like if I walked up with my Microsoft smart card to one of your companies and plugged it in and gave my details, my username and password, your domain controllers will be like, who are you? What are you doing on my computers? I can't authenticate you. I can't generate credentials that mean anything. Away you go. So now I'm not logging into my production environment anymore. I can only log in to a red forest environment. Now I have a technology control enforcing the policy that I know is a good idea for credential hygiene. And in the environment where I can log in, I can't go in and turn off auditing. I can't do anything else that may mask the activities. I can actually have some degree of control. Also gives a home for me to start putting in all of these systems that I need to have for domain administration in an isolated world. Because if I am running this administrative environment, I do need to make sure that I can continue to have whatever reporting that I need going on, monitoring, alerts, all of these things. Authentication, typically we would say keep it small, right? Reducing the size of your tier 0 is the easiest way to keep it more secure. Less to watch over means more success watching it. So continuing to reduce the architecture, the minimum required to support this is the approach that we advocate. Here now I can start to build some policies around how to control administrators and do it a lot more securely. There is a lot more overhead to this, but the solution space allows me to actually begin to enforce these. I still want to have policies and enforce these credential hygiene type behaviors, but this allows me to actually go through and drive compliance to the maximum extent possible. Now, they're not the only admins. Yes, we focus on them. We have this whole big architecture. There's a lot of details in the Pass the Hash white paper for those who are interested. What about for my other administrators? I'm the administrator of the SQL box that has all the data that you want and maybe has the decryption keys for what's in some other system or whatever the case may be. I also want to protect those folks. Well, unlike a domain admin, being the administrator of a system doesn't by default give you permission to everything else. So what I can do there is simply say, you know what, just have a hardened workstation. Well, define hardened workstation. What does that mean? That means I want to make sure you're not doing the type of things that potentially leads to bad things happening. Where do most attacks get sourced? Somewhere on the internet. I don't want to be doing arbitrary web browsing from a system that has high-value credentials. So we can block that in a hardened workstation. I don't want to be doing email and productivity work. I can block that in a hardened workstation. I have all of this control that I don't otherwise have, very valuable, that I can do on a hardened workstation. So I want to put in those controls. Now, I also need to think practically about what the user experience would be like. Because when we at Microsoft implement the administrative forest for domain administration, we'll typically assign you a laptop to do that on. It's often one a lot like the one I carry around here, a little Surface, because it's thin and light, and it doesn't really need a lot of horsepower. You're just opening up admin tools. And it sticks in my bag next to whatever other productivity device I'm using, usually side-by-side devices. A lot of times when you start talking about your tier 1, all of your server administration, you're like, I don't want to buy all these schmucks and an extra laptop. That's kind of a lot of money. Virtualization is a most common approach that we see to that. Let's actually just run a hardened workstation, but we'll let you have a VM, and in the VM, that can be your productivity workstation. And that separation of efforts also allows us to take advantage of all of the great things that modern operating systems are doing for us, but avoiding all the bad things like, oh, all of my stuff doesn't work because I'm still running software written in 1993. I can still have a Windows 7 VM for productivity because that's where my apps are known to work while doing my administration from the most secure platform that I can. But for tier 1, that turns out to be a really secure way to do it. And the more I'm able to move my domain functional level up and take advantage of things like authentication policies and authentication policy silos, I can begin to enforce more and more about where I can or can't log in and provide that level of control. Credential hygiene starting with that process and with education and assisted with technology. And I want to use this for the cloud as well. Because when you think about the cloud, right, we're so used to thinking about the admin, but if I am running an Office 365 tenant or I'm running an Azure tenant, then access to that gives me access to everything inside of there. And that becomes itself a very high-value asset. In fact, we saw one company that today is no longer in business. There was a place called Code Spaces. This was public. It's in the news. What they did was they provided a place for you to store your source code up in the cloud. And they handled it for you, so you wanted to do Git, great. You don't have to throw up a server, just use our service, right? We'll provide you with all these great services to go along with it. Hurrah, everything is terrific. Well, the adversary managed to get a hold of their credentials. It happened to be AWS, but they got their credentials, and they had access to all of their data. And they were able to say, give us some money, or we'll go ahead and delete everything, and everything will be gone. And they said, well, we're not going to give you that money. So what did they do? They deleted everything. And so all of the customers who said, I'm going to trust you with my source code, you're going to store it all for me, suddenly had no more source code. And the company went out of business. It was an end-of-life experience for them, right? So this is the other thing we need to keep in mind. When I'm thinking about high-value asset and credentials, it's not just AD credentials. It's access to a service. If I'm running Salesforce.com, software as a service, the access to that entry point gives me access potentially to lots of data inside of there. So putting in security controls and using a hardened workstation approach for that, also very important to make sure that those credentials don't get taken. If the service offers you multi-factor authentication, you should take it. How many of you use Outlook.com for email or Microsoft accounts or anything like that? How many of you have not turned on multi-factor authentication for that? So a handful of folks still. MFA is free. You go in and it's kind of hidden. It's like weirdly hidden, I think, right? But it's in there, right? If it provides that, that helps to reduce the surface area where people can get in. So credential hygiene, don't put them on untrusted devices. The other thing to think about when it comes to protecting your credentials is, am I going to carry them all around with me all the time? Or am I going to get them when I need them? Right? Can I get my credentials when I want them? Right? If you're familiar with privileged account management in Microsoft Identity Manager, right, it gives you the ability to implement a vault type of approach. Not a credential vault, though there are several of them out there, but rather to say, you know what, I'm going to have my identity, which I can enforce with whatever multi-factor I want to. I'm just not going to have the privileges that I don't always want with me. I don't need to have them all with me all the time. I can instead say, you know what, I'm going to connect to some server somewhere, and I need to get my server admin rights enabled for that. So I'm going to say, I'm going to start working on this at about 10 o'clock. I only need it till noon, so why don't you add my identity to group membership in the server admins for that group, starting at 10 o'clock, and at 12 o'clock, take it away. So now, if you happen to grab my credentials while I'm on that server between 10 and 12, then you will have admin rights for that server. Otherwise, you won't have admin rights for that server. And what you also won't have is admin rights for any other server that I haven't requested permission to access. So now the window of opportunity in which an adversary can gain access to credentials that are of value to them has reduced. All of these activities are around reducing the amount of time that these are good, much like reducing the amount of time that I'm able to use credentials I might steal by eliminating wdigest or lmhash, which have the longest potential amount of time. This further reduces the amount of time of the utility of those credentials. I'll never get rid of them, but I can reduce it. Thinking about credentials also, I've got a couple different types of accounts. We spent a lot of time talking about domain accounts, server admins, domain admins. Those are domain types, but there's also local accounts, which, as we learned in the pre-show, now have a new well-known SID that we can use to ACL against them. But local accounts are potentially another way that we can start to spread laterally to take an initial compromise of one device and use that as a means to go and grab a bunch of other ones. And this is something that historically we haven't done a terribly great job of, right? The most common implementation I would see is you'd build a new device, and that device would get a local administrator account, and it would be the same on every single device. And if it's the same on every single device, once you've grabbed one, you can log into every other one with the exact same credentials. Now, with use of that well-known SID, you can block network authentication, right? Now, defense and depth, you've got a protection now. Because before, if you logged in with a local account, then you just open up some file share on the other one, you'll just send over the hash of that account, and the other computer will be like, oh, yeah, you're the admin? Great, I got you too. And you're on that device. Now you can turn off that network authentication. We backported that to Win7, enable it in the group policy, and that now becomes impossible. Awesome. But if I still get the password, I could still do an interactive login potentially. It'd be kind of cool if I didn't have that exactly the same everywhere. So we built that. Actually, a guy named Jiri built that. And we give it away. It's called LAPS, the Local Admin Password Solution. What LAPS does is it says, you know what, I'm going to give you an easy mechanism to go and store local admin passwords. I'll generate a unique one. I'll escrow them away. I'll stick them into the directory into a protected attribute. And now I can have a unique password on every single device using nothing but free software. Now, I do have to extend the schema, so I've got to go in and say, oh, I've got to create a place in which I can store this information. A little PowerShell script will do that, but once I have extended that, then I can start to create random passwords on every device. Now, there's a few group policies around that. I'll kind of go through them. Right? When I go into the password settings, when I enable it, I can say, all right, here are the different options that I can enforce around, well, what kind of password complexity do I want to have on these accounts? How long do I want it to be? And how old can it be? And this is going to be communicated. The policy will be picked up by the agent. So you do have an agent now running on every single workstation that's doing this interaction. That's reading the policies and doing the implementation to randomize the password. And every n number of days, it's going to go through and rotate the password. Now it's got a new one. You can also choose to put in a different name. Now, if you've left it as administrator, not a problem. But if you've renamed the administrator account or choose to have it be a different account, that's something else that's explicitly supported. Today, it's only allowed for one account, so you can't go through and have multiple randomized passwords. You get just one, but it doesn't have to be administrator. And the overall, enable local admin account password management to start using these settings. Now, there's one setting, and I actually had a bit of a conversation with my friend beforehand around this. This is the don't let someone put in something silly setting. We consider this to be the optional enable this and enforce it. What this says is you're going to have a setting that will say rotate it every X number of days. But there's also a UI. And I can go in through this UI and say, you know what, I'm going to go grab a device, right? So here's the computer name. So maybe it's Steve B's computer. And then I go find it, and then I can set the new expiration time for the new password. And if I don't set that policy, I can put literally whatever I want to on there, above and beyond this. And so what this final policy says is, you know what, don't let them put something that exceeds that. If you said the absolute limit, the longest you can go is a day, and they try to put in 2 days, they'll be like, wrong answer, whereas otherwise you can. That's what this final policy does, is say, you know what, everything abides by that rule, even a careless admin is going to be held constrained to that rule. So now you've got agents running, generating, turning, and spinning out new random passwords on all of your devices and escrowing them away into Active Directory. Now, they get escrowed away. There's a lot of conversation about this. The way they get filed away is it's not going to be encrypted. And everyone's like, oh, well, we don't have unencrypted things in there. And what the consistent feedback we get is, well, if you do encrypt it, you've got to store your keys somewhere, right? There's sort of this infinite regression of ifs, right? Eventually, you're going to have the ability to reverse it because you have to be able to grab it from somewhere, right? And you could build more infrastructure to support that. But I think the most compelling thing I heard is if someone's already has the ability to go in and root around all of those hidden attributes in your Active Directory, your problem is not lapse. Your problem is the guy who's already looking at the other stuff that's a whole lot more valuable. So great free way to continue to protect and further defend the environment from a local password perspective. Going onward, right, as we then think, well, where else are we going? This has been an area of huge investment. If we look at what we did in Windows 8 and 8.1, we reduced the number of credentials that we were storing at all, right? And we reduced the amount of time. What we've been doing in Windows 10, very similar. Let's reduce the amount of time. So Windows 10, and it was actually really funny, I got Ben, so I don't even know what he is anymore. So it was Ben the PC guy for a while, and then he became Ben the phone guy, and now he's Ben the Hyper-V guy. He's eventually probably just going to stop and just call himself Ben the guy, because he keeps moving around. But he was like, oh, just talk about this feature. I love the feature. I've got a whole demo side by side of what we're doing. The feature now is called Credential Guard, and here's the idea, is to further reduce the amount of time that credentials are available for an adversary to take them. And we do that by saying as soon as everything's generated, you've got all this stuff, right, we're going to escrow away this information. We're in essence going to take that LSAS memory and we're going to protect it. Now, here's what that protection means to kind of give you an explanation of what's going on under the covers. So Hyper-V as a hypervisor gives you the ability to host VMs. We all presumably know that. You can do VMs on a server, you can do them on a client, right? Client Hyper-V does that. But in a Hyper-V device, there's always going to be one device that's the root VM, and that's what you log into first. So you're almost always on the root, and the root can do whatever it wants to and can control the hypervisor. What the hypervisor will do, and what we leverage in Windows 10, is it gives you the ability to add in virtual trust levels, or VTL, right, which is an even deeper construct than the processor rings that we have in standard Windows. So if you're a super Windows, what's going on, kernel mode, user mode type nerd, you already know ring 3, ring 0, right? Ring 0 is your kernel mode code, ring 3 is your user mode code, and ring 2 and 1 just aren't used because we need to do with them. So because we like things to be confusing, apparently, we actually sort of inverted that and said ring 0 is the most trusted one, and VTL 0 is most trusted, VTL 1 VTL 1 is more trusted, 0 is less trusted. Have these different trust levels in the hypervisor. So your VM, because you're kind of really technically running in a VM now, for Windows is now running at VTL 0, and we run a separate security infrastructure that sits at VTL 1. So 0 can't control it. So when you're authenticating, we have what's called a trustlet, a tiny bit of code. And that trustlet is what holds that, what used to be sitting in LSAS, and does the generation. So you are still inside of your Windows instance when you're typing your credentials. So if you think about threat exposure, the bad guy could grab your credentials while you're typing them. But once they're typed and the memory's been sent off, it's sent into the LSAS trustlet sitting inside and running at VTL1. Now I don't have access to that memory. As local admin, as local system, I don't have access to that memory from inside of Windows itself. The hypervisor is protecting that, and the hypervisor is a security boundary in Windows. So now the window of time I have to take my credentials decreases to really close to 0. Not quite 0, because you're still typing your creds, but really close. So we're reducing time. I'm keeping you off of untrusted devices, so I'm reducing where I can grab it. I'm keeping you not having all the privilege you need all the time, which is the principle of most privilege, but taking the principle of least privilege. Grab what I want when I need it, and then give it back. And now I'm only holding on to it for the smallest amount of time and delegating responsibility for passing that around to something that's protected by a trust boundary in Windows. Better, better, better. Defense in depth, I'm improving and improving and improving. Some other things to think about. Well, what else can I do to protect my credentials, to protect the assets that I have? And if I were to say, what's the single most important thing and most valuable thing you can be doing, it's stay up to date. Nearly all of the major headline-leading breaches had a common denominator of they were running old stuff. In fact, some really terrifying statistics when you think about how good we may or may not be at patching. When we look at all of the cybersecurity incidents that happened in 2015, 99% of them had the initial entry point exploit of a security hole that had been patched in the previous year or earlier. They just hadn't applied the patches. And even more scary, 90% of them had exploited a security vulnerability that had been patched in 2007 or earlier. We kind of suck at staying up to date. And that's really important. Up to date on your operating systems, up to date on your software. How many of you can credibly say, I work at a company and there is not a single device in the entire company that is running anything but the very latest version of Java? So the running total of that is still 0. Never anywhere around the world, right? That's really important. In side note on that, just to kind of digress a little bit, there's a little tool called the Java Deployment Rule Sets. How many of you have heard of that? A handful of folks, right? I'd never heard of it. We were actually going to build that feature, and a customer we were piloting on was like, why are you writing this? We already have it. We're like, what? That allows you to containerize and say, you know what, only use this for this little tiny bit, and otherwise use the latest, which is actually kind of a neat little thing that I had no idea existed. So a little plug for a tool that I'd never heard of before. Stay current on security updates, stay current on software, and where you can, use the memory protections that are available. When they don't come in, configure that way. Emmet gives you the ability to configure, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The reason why is that I'm seeing the rise in importance of protecting the application layer, not just the OS layer. When we look at what's being actively exploited, applications are really spiking. And they're spiking because of the way that we've always thought about security. Security from an app level used to be, everything's fine, and we'll just turn off the stuff that turns out to be bad. And everything is kind of a lot, and people are installing all kinds of stuff, and sometimes they don't even know it. And you just can't keep up with all the bad stuff that's going out there. I mean, I've seen statistics that suggest that up to 2/3 of all the software available for download on the web is or contains malware, if you look at all the downloads that are out there. So how do you protect the application layer, which is how the bad guys are getting in and rooting around for your credentials? One thing is to run only known and trusted code. And boy, doesn't this slide look familiar. Same architecture. We are protecting your LSAS memory. We can also use that to gate what runs. So we've had a technology that sort of evolved over time. It started with software restriction policies, and then it evolved into AppLocker. And AppLocker was really good. The problem with AppLocker is if you're the local administrator, what do? You turn it off if you're the bad guy. Right? And we see that all the time. We were having a conversation just yesterday about, you can turn off LM hash and protect these passwords, but I believe even Mimikatz now has the option to go ahead and turn that back on and then collect it for you helpfully, because you're the administrator. And you're trying to defend against someone who might get administrative credentials. How do you protect that? How do you keep code that you don't trust from running? Put it on the other side of a Hyper-V protected trust slip. Now I can validate. Unless this trust that says it's okay to run, I am not running it and have that baked in. Now I can take this protection that I got from AppLocker and put it on crack. Keep it so that nothing's going to run that I don't want to run. And that's going to protect my applications from being launched. And then I think about, all right, so I've stopped you from being launched. How do I stop untrusted code from being injected in there with security vulnerabilities that maybe are memory-based in nature, which is a common way to attack it. I can build that in with a tool that we call Emmet. Now, most of Emmet is leveraging tools that are built into Windows, memory protections that are already there, but the person writing the software would have to go in and flip a configuration option, turn it on. And a lot of them don't. Maybe they wrote it before it existed. Emmet gives you the ability to turn those things on and say, you know what, I'd like this memory protection for this software, please. Some things, maybe the compiler option was there, but they didn't choose it, often because they have a broad add-in ecosystem, i.e., an Office. Turn on as many as they can, but they can't turn on everything because they might break your add-ins. But you can choose to say, you know what, I'll go ahead and test it in my environment, and if it works for me, maybe I'd like to have that protection. But now I'm not only helping to protect against code that's run, that gets started as its own process, but about arbitrary code the adversary might be trying to inject. If you're running Windows 10, incidentally, you should know that Emmet 5.2 isn't going to be a happy place for you. 5.5 is what you want to land on, and that should be shipping any time now. There's a beta available today that you can go ahead and grab and download, but that just provides additional protection to help ensure that you don't have people injecting code into processes that you've allowed to run, right? Whitelisting is the new blacklisting, and now you're whitelisting even within a process and adding additional protections. None of this, of course, being a replacement for building the code securely in the first place, right? And there's nothing that we are more diligent about within Microsoft than following SDL. When you look at the LAPS tool was created by an individual, but in order to get to the point of shipping, it had to go through an entire SDL process. All of our shipping software, Windows, Office, our browsers, our productivity applications, Dynamics, everything goes through this end-to-end process that begins with ensuring that our people know how to write secure software, that they've written secure requirements, they have a secure design, they have a secure implementation, they're not using banned functions, that we have validation, we do pen testing, we do fuzz testing, that we've done everything that we currently know today to write better software. Right? All the bases of protecting the application layer. And when we then think through, right, like, all right, so we're going to protect our credentials, we're going to have good credential hygiene, and we're going to protect the application layer, we're going to transition to whitelisting where we can, can't always everywhere, and that's really tough, right? And I know that when we talk about modernizing and currency, and I think software currency is a very important security feature. Where do most software upgrade projects begin? If you're updating the version of Windows, what's step one? What apps do I have? And if your step one is, I don't know what's running, it's kind of hard to go to a whitelist, right? But you make some progress, and you start moving forward and transforming the environment to espouse these principles. What about respond? Right? And this is the final bit, right? This is what I want to kind of touch upon lightly. What do I do if something goes wrong? And I'll reference this particularly around the workstation. So responding for tier 2. I have a workstation and it's been compromised. Someone double-clicked. I couldn't put them on a whitelist. They ran some software and now the box is toast. How do I respond to that? There was a lot of excitement and energy, and rightly so, for the fact that you don't need to build a brand new image for Windows 10. You can just upgrade in place. Got your Windows 7 box, just throw it right on top, no reinstalling your apps, that whole process, all that stuff that we built for our Windows 7 or our Windows 8 or our Windows 8.1 migrations, we don't really need it anymore. Well, here's the thing. You kind of do, because what do you do if someone owns an endpoint device? Well, the principle is, once someone owns it, you can never be completely sure that you ever have it back again. Unless you do scorched earth. Burn it down, build it up again. That deployment infrastructure you built to get to Windows 7, golden, lets you repave the machine. If your data is stuck somewhere else in the cloud, off the device, and you just have a local cache on the device, your apps are all loaded into System Center or whatever else you're losing, and you've got your OS deployment capabilities all still online, Burn it down, fire it up again, apps drop down, data drops down, users back in business. Awesome. Tier 2 recoveries should be easy, leveraging the work you did to get to Win 7, Win 8, Win 8.1. Tier 1, a little bit harder because you've got SLAs, but the process still remains. Burn it down, build a new one, throw the apps back on. Maybe you're doing it side by side here rather than putting them offline for a bit. Still the same approach, scorched earth. Tier 0, domain compromise. Burning down your Active Directory, kind of hard. Greenfield, kind of hard. Right? A lot of greenfield, because as soon as they're like, the domain's been owned and you'll never again be completely certain that you have it back, most people are like, oh, then my goodness, we're going to build a new one. Then they start building one and seeing what it takes to migrate to an entire brand new Active Directory, and they're like, wow, this really sucks. Let's stop doing this. This can't possibly be worth it. And the transition that I'm seeing more and more is not burn it down, build a new one, because that's hard and expensive and long. But I'm starting to see a lot of interest in a concept we call the Diamond Island. You know what? Here's kind of a cesspool over here, but we kind of got to live in the cesspool, and it's not so awesome, but it's the best cesspool we've got. And we'll just put whatever detection controls we want. We'll keep an eye on things, make sure it's all good. But this thing I don't want in the cesspool. This is really important. I'm for Coca-Cola, and the recipe for Coca-Cola is here. Let's build a forest in which that is trusted, known good, do all of the right things that we talked about over the course of the session in this environment, rather than moving everything, rather than boil the ocean, protect this. It's our highest value asset. And then maybe gradually we'll move more stuff over as it becomes more valuable. But I'm at least going to start to partition this and have known good without a either move it all and burn the thing down or move nothing and just try my best to live in the cesspool. But there's an intermediary, and this is what I'm starting to see gain a lot more popularity. So as I leave you here today, right, a couple thoughts I'd like to leave in your mind around what you could be doing to further take these concepts and go down the path of securing the infrastructure. I'll say it again because I can't emphasize enough. Get current and stay current. Find a way. Windows as a service is really all about getting on board with the concept of I can get on board. And that's across the board, all the platforms. Your Silverlights, your Javas, your Adobes, your Windows, your IE, Office, all these different things. Right? Don't recklessly plow through them, but find ways to become more agile because that has huge security benefits across the board. Move to whitelisting. Run only trusted stuff. Reduce the number of admins you have at every level. If you have 200 domain admins, that's too many. If every workstation in your environment is technically a domain admin, that's too many. Server admins, reduce where they have permission, reduce it in time. Local admins, reduce who has there, because most of the tools to exploit a workstation and steal identity require domain admins. If you've turned off UAC and made everyone an admin, it's trivially easy to pop your box. And then 4, isolate. Build partitions and think about investing more in protecting your highest value assets. Because right now we're at war. We have human adversaries, and they are out to get us. But we can make smart decisions. We can bring in these good hygiene practices, and we can make a difference. So, noble warriors, I wish you good luck, and thank you very much.